The ground shook with panic as a massive 9-foot alligator surfaced in the HOA's pristine pool, jaws snapping. People screamed, scrambling to escape, but the creature moved with eerie calm. News crews arrived in seconds, capturing every moment. I stood back watching the chaos unfold, knowing this was exactly what I had warned them about. The HOA thought I was crazy when I built my creek barrier, but nature doesn't follow HOA rules. Now, as the gator basked in their blue waters, I couldn't help but wonder, was this nature's revenge, or just the beginning? Karen Whitmore didn't need much of an introduction. As the HOA president, she was Oak Glen's self-appointed queen, and she ruled with a strict eye on every little detail. Dressed in pastel cardigans and an air of superiority, she had a particular obsession with keeping the neighborhood perfect, even if it meant ignoring basic safety. When I built the creek barrier, I was prepared for her disapproval. It wasn't about the aesthetics, though. I told her it was for safety to keep the alligators out of the yard and off the street. But Karen didn't care about that. To her, it was an eyesore that ruined her precious view of the creek. "It's a visual disturbance," she declared, as if that was a reasonable excuse to ignore the real problem lurking just a few feet away. I tried reasoning with her, even offered a compromise, but Karen's mind was made up. The neighborhood, in her view, had to stay pristine, no matter the cost. That cost, I would soon find out, was far higher than she realized. When I was out of town for a VA appointment, the HOA tore down my barrier without notice, claiming it obstructed communal drainage flow. They didn't care about the gators or the danger they posed. They cared about keeping everything just so. And that arrogance, it was about to bite them back in a way they'd never expected. I moved to Oak Glen because I wanted peace, something I hadn't had in years. After 2 decades of service with the Army Corps of Engineers, I was done with chaos. I longed for a neighborhood where the biggest worry was what color to paint the fence, where the grass grew tall and the trees provided shade. Oak Glen seemed perfect for that. When I first arrived, everything was quiet. The houses were spacious, set back from the road, and surrounded by the kind of greenery that made you feel like you could breathe a little deeper. Sure, the HOA had its quirks, rules about mailbox sizes, lawn care, and how to properly trim hedges, but I figured I could manage that. It was a small price to pay for tranquility. Then the alligator showed up. It was 2 summers ago, during a particularly brutal stretch of heat. I stepped out one morning to get the paper, and there it was, a 6'1", 2-foot-long alligator lounging right in front of my door like it owned the place. It wasn't the kind of thing you ignore. I stood there, frozen, watching it as it lazily soaked up the sun. At first I thought I was dreaming. But no, it was real. I had to shoo it back into the creek, but not before I'd caught a good look at its size and strength. That was my first real warning. I knew that creek wasn't just a peaceful stream, it was a direct access point to the wild. That afternoon, I started building the barrier. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was sturdy. Composite panels, steel mesh, reinforced with sandbags and fitted to the creek's bend. It took me several days to finish, but I wasn't about to take chances. That barrier was my line in the sand. It wasn't just about keeping out alligators, it was about feeling safe in my own home. But when Karen Whitmore saw it, everything changed. She was the HOA president, and to her, the barrier wasn't just ugly, it was an affront to her vision of the neighborhood. I explained that it was for safety, that the alligators were a real concern. She didn't care. "It ruins the view," she said. That was all it took for her to get the HOA involved. From that moment on, it wasn't about the safety of the neighborhood, it was about keeping things pretty. And soon enough, that mentality would lead to disaster. The HOA didn't see the danger. They saw an eyesore. It started off slow, almost like an annoyance I could brush off. A couple of notices slipped under my door. The first simply stated my creek barrier was out of compliance with HOA guidelines. No specifics, just a vague complaint. I figured it was a typical HOA overreach. But then the next notice came, this time with a threat. Remove the structure immediately or face fines. They had never even asked for my side. The tone grew more demanding with each letter. Violating HOA rules. A blight on the neighborhood. It felt like they were taking it personally. I tried to keep my cool, but something didn't sit right. The letters weren't just about the fence. They were an attack on my property, on my right to keep my home safe. It was clear that Karen was behind it. It wasn't just a battle over some wood and mesh anymore. Every day I felt more like I was fighting to keep control of my own space. The situation escalated quickly. One afternoon I came home from a quick errand, and the moment I rounded the corner of my house, I froze. The barrier gone. Ripped out posts torn from the ground, the mesh shredded. I stood there in stunned silence, feeling the weight of betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. My eyes found the small orange flag buried in the mud with the HOA's seal. They'd done it. The HOA had crossed the line, trespassing on my property, destroying something I'd built with my own hands. I was furious. The barrier wasn't just an eyesore, it was a safety measure, one I'd put in place after a 6'1", 2-foot gator had wandered onto my lawn. I was angry, but more than that, I was deeply unsettled. They hadn't even waited for me to return. They knew I'd be out for a medical appointment and took full advantage of it. I knew this wasn't going to end here. It wasn't just a violation of my property anymore. It was an outright attack on my rights as a homeowner. I spent hours documenting the damage, taking pictures of the broken posts and the exposed bank. It wasn't just that the barrier was gone, it was that the ground around the creek was beginning to erode. Without the barrier, the bank was destabilizing. The once calm creek was swelling with the rain, and I could see the water beginning to creep up the bank, churning like a wild animal. I knew if the rains kept coming, it would only get worse. But there was more at stake than just erosion. The barrier had been put in place to keep the alligators away, something the HOA clearly hadn't understood. I started pulling up my old photos and emails, showing the board the gator sightings I had reported over the past few years. I emailed them again, but this time I copied the county environmental office, hoping someone would finally take me seriously. It wasn't just the damage to my land, it was the liability. The HOA had acted recklessly, and I was certain that if anything went wrong, they would try to blame me. I kept checking the creek, watching the water rise. It wasn't just flooding, it was creating a direct path for the alligators back into the community. I could feel the clock ticking. It was only a matter of time before something happened. The inevitable happened sooner than I expected. A few days after the destruction, I got a call from a county officer. "We've had a complaint about unauthorized construction," he said, a formal tone in his voice. "I'll need to come by and inspect the property." The HOA was now pulling in the authorities to back up their actions. They couldn't just leave things alone, they had to make me the problem. When the officer arrived, I took him straight to the creek. The damage was evident. The exposed bank was eroding rapidly, and without the barrier, the creek was more dangerous than ever. The officer nodded, taking notes, his face grim. "I'll report this," he said, clicking his pen. "This is a problem." The moment he confirmed the danger, I knew I wasn't the only one who saw the consequences. The HOA couldn't keep pretending this was just a simple misunderstanding. They had made a mistake, one that could cost someone their safety. I just hoped they would be held accountable before something truly went wrong. That night, the storm rolled in, heavy and relentless. The creek swelled with the rain, the water rising inch by inch, churning and pulling at the bank. I could hear it from my porch, a constant roar as the current grew stronger. And then around 2 a.m. Scout went rigid by the door. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped into my boots. As I stepped outside, I saw the creek. The water was higher now, almost spilling over. Then I saw them two glowing eyes just above the surface. The alligator had returned, and it was even bigger than before, at least 9 feet long. It glided silently through the water, headed straight toward the neighborhood. I knew exactly where it was going, the HOA's pristine pool, the one they cared so much about. I stood there in the dark rain pounding down on me, watching the creature move with terrifying calm. I had warned them. I had done everything I could to prevent this. And now, there was nothing left to do but watch as the nightmare unfolded. It wasn't just a warning anymore, it was the inevitable consequence of their actions. The HOA's refusal to listen had led them straight to this moment, and there was no turning back. By the time the HOA board meeting arrived, the tension was unbearable. I was prepared to speak not just for myself, but for anyone who had felt the weight of Karen's decisions. The room was packed with residents, most of them there out of curiosity. They didn't know it yet, but the HOA was about to face a reckoning. Karen was at the head of the table, her usual tight smile plastered on her face, but there was a nervous edge to her now. I stood up when my name was called, walking to the front with my binder full of evidence. Karen's eyes flickered toward me, but she didn't say a word. I didn't need to speak loudly to get their attention. I simply started, "I'm here because the HOA removed a safety structure from my property without due process, and now the neighborhood is at risk." The room went quiet. I presented the photos of the alligator on my lawn. I showed them the emails I had sent. When I reached the page with the video footage of the gator in my yard, I saw Karen's expression falter. This wasn't just a neighbor's complaint anymore, it was a public safety issue. She knew it. The room knew it. And now, the board was going to have to deal with the fallout. I could feel the tension rise as I slid the tablet across the table. "This is from my security camera," I said, pointing to the timestamp on the screen. The footage started with the shadow of a long, sinuous figure sliding across my yard, moving slowly, deliberately. It was unmistakable. The alligator, at least 6, 1/2 feet long, gliding past the corner of my house. The footage was grainy, but the shape was clear. As the gator made its way toward the creek, Scout could be heard barking frantically behind the glass door, his nose pressed to the window in panic. I paused the video to let it sink in. This happened in July 2 years ago, I continued. I reported it to the HOA. I sent you these photos showing the gator just a few feet from my house, but no one responded. I pulled up the email thread highlighting the messages I had sent. The urgent subject lines, alligator sighting, immediate action needed. The board remained silent, their eyes glued to the screen. I pressed on. That's the same creek where my barrier stood, and it's the same creek you tore down the barrier to improve the view. But now, without it, we've got gators wandering right into the neighborhood. Is that really the view you wanted? I let the silence hang in the air, watching as the video footage played out. I could see Karen's composure begin to crack. She had no defense for the footage, no way to explain it away as a mistake. I watched Karen shift uncomfortably in her seat, trying to regain control, but it was clear the evidence was undeniable. I pulled out the removal notice, the one I had received from the HOA after they destroyed my barrier. "This is the official notice you sent me," I said, placing it firmly on the table. "You removed my safety structure without any prior hearing, without any consultation with me. The notice claims that my barrier obstructed drainage flow. But here's where you made your mistake." I held up a county floodplain map pointing to the exact location of my property in the creek. This map clearly shows the creek as a designated floodway, and my barrier was built according to county flood mitigation standards. The barrier didn't obstruct drainage. It was designed to help manage it. I could see the realization dawn on some of the board members. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Here's the real issue. I continued sliding over photos of the erosion that had started almost immediately after the barrier was torn down. Without the barrier, the creek bank began to erode. This is the result of your actions. The floodwater has started creeping higher with every rainfall. And if you think this is just about a barrier, it's not. This is about the alligators. I turned the page in my binder to a new photo, a clear shot of the creek where the barrier had once stood. This is the creek right now. You remove the barrier, and now gators have direct access to the neighborhood. A few days ago, I saw another alligator. This one was even bigger, right where the barrier used to be. I've been reporting these sightings for years, but you didn't listen. And now, we've got a 9-foot gator on our doorstep. I could hear murmurs around the room, and Karen's face turned pale. She tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. Your disregard for safety has turned this neighborhood into a liability. Someone could have been hurt. Hell, someone could still be hurt if that gator decides to wander back toward the pool. This is on you. The room went dead silent. Karen was no longer the confident HOA president. She was just a woman with no good excuses left. After the meeting, everything changed. The room had been tense, but now there was a strange sense of calm in the air. Neighbors, many of whom had been quiet up until now, began speaking up. One by one, people came forward sharing their own concerns about safety, about the HOA's overreach. A woman in the back stood up, her voice shaky but firm. I remember that video. It was on Nextdoor, wasn't it? The one with the gator crossing the lawn. I didn't think it was real at first. Another neighbor spoke up. "I have kids who play outside. This isn't just about a fence, it's about our safety." I looked around the room, and for the first time, I saw people who weren't just passive bystanders. They were ready to stand together. As the meeting ended, I felt a mix of relief and anger. The HOA could no longer pretend they hadn't been warned. Their negligence had finally caught up with them, and they were scrambling to contain the fallout. Karen avoided eye contact with me as she packed up her things, but I could see the panic behind her composed exterior. The residents weren't angry, they were relieved. Relieved that someone had stood up to the HOA. Relieved that they no longer had to live in fear of a board that didn't care about their safety. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some allies in this fight. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The HOA's legal team sent me letters trying to argue that they had done everything by the book, but their attempts to deflect were futile. The county and Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission got involved, launching their own investigations. The damage was done. Finally, the HOA received a formal penalty notice from the state, $27, 400 inches fines, for the destruction of a legally approved wildlife deterrent and for violating protected migratory corridors. The penalty didn't just hit them financially, it exposed the HOA's reckless actions. They had removed a safety feature without following proper procedures, and now they were paying the price. The board was forced to hold an emergency meeting, and by the end of it, Karen and 2 other board members had resigned. They couldn't escape the scrutiny. The remaining members tried to backpedal, but the damage to their reputation was irreversible. The community had seen what they were capable of, and they weren't buying any more of their excuses. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board, composed mostly of parents who had learned the hard way, began to work with county officials and wildlife experts to develop a new safety policy for the creek. It was a long, tedious process, but it was the right one. And when the new barrier went up stronger, legally approved and with all the proper permits, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood. I didn't build the original barrier to prove a point, I built it to keep us safe. But now, it felt like something even more important had been achieved. A community had come together, not just to fight against the HOA, but to stand up for what was right. As I worked on the new barrier, neighbors stopped by to help. Dale brought his tools, Eddie and his cousin brought a wheelbarrow, and even Tony from the fire department stopped by to offer a hand. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about rebuilding trust. Karen's house went up for sale quietly, no for sale sign, just a moving truck, in the early hours of the morning. No one in the neighborhood missed her. The last I heard, she moved to a more private area, somewhere far away from Oak Glen. The following spring, I sat at the first meeting of the new safety committee. This time, there were no clipboard-wielding board members trying to dictate the rules. Instead, people listened. They understood now that safety always comes first, no matter the aesthetics. And when it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I didn't build this fence to prove a point. I built it because I've seen what happens when we ignore the dangers around us. The room was silent, and for once, it felt like I had the support of the entire community behind me. A month later, I received a letter from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. Inside, there was a framed certificate, recognizing my efforts to protect the wildlife corridors and ensure the safety of the community. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the final piece of justice. The barriers were stronger now, and so was the neighborhood. As I sat on my porch one evening, Scout lying at my feet, I looked out at the creek, now calm and peaceful again. The fence stood strong and sturdy, and the neighborhood felt safer than ever. The creek no longer held secrets, no longer a hidden threat, and I no longer feared the alligators. They understood the boundary now, and so did everyone else. Sometimes nature speaks in ways we can't ignore, but it's not always about the fight. Sometimes it's about finding the peace that comes after.